She had nothing left to lose. A dead husband, an infant daughter, and 47 cents in a cracked leather purse. That was the full inventory of Evelyn Mercer's life when she stepped off that wagon into the Montana cold. The man standing in the doorway of the Hawthorne Ranch looked at her the way a person looks at a mistake they didn't make but are about to pay for. "I hired a cook," Caleb Hawthorne said, his voice flat as the frozen ground beneath her boots. "Not a nursemaid with a baby." She didn't flinch. She had survived worse than his silence. "Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with us until the very end." The wagon that carried Evelyn Mercer into the Gallatin Valley broke an axle 7 miles outside of Bozeman, and she walked the last 2 miles through ankle-deep mud, with Rose bundled against her chest and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder that held everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a cooking knife, a photograph she rarely let herself look at, and a folded letter from a man named Caleb Hawthorne that had been forwarded to her twice before it finally caught up with her in Omaha. Experienced cook needed. Isolated ranch. Hard conditions. Fair wage. No nonsense. That was the entirety of the advertisement she had answered 3 months earlier. The letter confirming her position was only slightly more generous with its words. Report to the Hawthorne Ranch, 12 miles south of Bozeman, no later than the 2nd week of November. You will be provided room and board in addition to your monthly wage. I run a working cattle operation. The men eat before dawn and after dark. I expect punctuality and competence. See Hawthorne. She had read that letter so many times the creases had worn soft as cloth. She'd memorized it not because she found it comforting, but because she was building the architecture of her next life out of whatever materials were available. And 12 dry words from a Montana rancher were what she had. Evelyn was 22 years old and had been a widow for 6 months. She did not allow herself to think about that for long. Whomped. The Hawthorne spread materialized through the gray November dusk like something imagined rather than built. A main house with a wraparound porch, 2 long bunkhouses, a massive barn with its red paint flaking off in wide strips, a smokehouse, a corral, and acres of fenced pasture rolling toward the Bridger Mountains in the distance. Even in the failing light, she could see it was a working ranch in the truest sense, functional, unadorned, slightly battered by weather and use, and utterly indifferent to comfort. She shifted Rose higher on her hip and walked up the front path. There were 3 men near the corral who stopped what they were doing to watch her approach. None of them came forward to help or to greet her. They just watched, the way men watch something that confuses them. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the particular wariness of people who don't encounter surprises often and have learned not to trust them. She knocked on the front door. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the door opened and Caleb Hawthorne looked at her. He was taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd formed any expectation at all from no nonsense and a capital letter initial. He had the kind of face that had been weathered down to its essential structure: jaw, cheekbone, brow, with dark eyes that took in information quickly and revealed very little in return. He was 31, though he could have passed for older. He wore no coat despite the cold, just a heavy flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and work trousers tucked into worn boots. He had clearly been interrupted from something. There was a smear of grease on his left forearm. He looked at Evelyn. Then he looked at Rose. Then he looked at Evelyn again. The silence that followed was the specific kind that has weight to it. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced that. "You hired me as your cook." "I hired a cook," Caleb said. "Yes." "Then we're in agreement." He didn't move from the doorway. "The advertisement didn't mention a child." "No," she said. "It didn't. My letter didn't either." "That's correct." "So you knew," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite anger. It was more contained than that, more controlled, which somehow made it worse. "You knew what you were coming to, and you didn't say anything." Evelyn looked at him squarely. "I answered your advertisement honestly. I am an experienced cook. I am punctual. I am competent. All of that remains true." "That's not the point." "I know what the point is, Mr. Hawthorne." "Do you?" "The point is that you feel deceived," she said, "and I understand that. But I have traveled over 1,000 miles with an infant daughter because I needed work and you offered it. And I would have told you about Rose if I thought it would have changed anything except your willingness to hire me." Something moved behind his eyes. Not softness. She didn't mistake it for that. Something closer to calculation. "It does change things," he said. "I understand." "A ranch isn't a nursery." "No," she agreed. "It's a working cattle operation. You eat before dawn and after dark. I read your letter, Mr. Hawthorne. I know what I'm walking into." He studied her for another moment. Then he looked at Rose again. Really looked at her this time, the way you look at something that has complicated an already complicated situation. Rose was 7 months old, dark-eyed, and round-cheeked, and she was staring at Caleb Hawthorne with the complete and fearless attention that only very young children and very old dogs can manage. She reached out one fat fist toward his face, as if she intended to examine him more closely. He stepped back slightly. "You'll leave at first light," he said. Evelyn didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with a man who had already decided. And tonight? A muscle tightened in his jaw. She watched him weigh it. The cold outside, the infant, the 1,000 miles she'd mentioned, the bare minimum of what a person could reasonably do and still live with themselves. "Tonight you can sleep in the storage room off the kitchen," he said. "It's warm. There's a cot." He said it like he was reading it from a list of obligations. "Don't mistake it for anything more than what it is." "I won't," she said. He stepped aside and let her in. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was the most telling room she'd seen in a long time. Not because of what was in it, but because of what wasn't. There was a cast iron stove, a good one, she could see that immediately, a majestic range with 6 burners and a warming shelf. But it was cold, and had clearly been cold for some time. The grate was full of old ash. There was a long work table down the center of the room, scarred with use, and above it a rack of pots and pans in various states of cleanliness. A Dutch oven sat on the stove with something dried and dark crusted to its inside. The floor hadn't been swept recently. The smell of the room was the smell of grease and cold and meals made fast and without care. A tin pot of beans sat on the back of the stove. Cold beans, by the look of them, from whenever they'd last been made. She set her bag down. She looked around the room the way a carpenter looks at a structure that has been badly maintained. Assessing, not judging, already thinking about what needs doing. Behind her, a man appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was shorter than Caleb, older, with a gray beard and the permanently squinting eyes of someone who'd spent decades in bright sunlight. He looked at her with unconcealed curiosity. "You're the new cook," he said. "Evelyn Mercer," she said, and shifted Rose to her left hip to offer her right hand. He shook it, apparently finding this funny in a gentle way. "Walt Briggs, I'm the foreman. Been foreman here going on 11 years. He looked at Rose. "That's a baby." "She is." "Boss know about her?" "He does now." Walt made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and pulled out one of the kitchen chairs to sit down. "How'd that go?" "He told me to leave at first light." Walt looked at her without particular surprise. "You planning on it?" "I don't have anywhere else to go," Evelyn said simply. Walt considered this. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man who has heard enough hard truths in his lifetime to recognize one when it presents itself without decoration. "Well," he said, "reckon we'll see what the morning brings." She fed Rose the last of the mashed sweet potatoes she'd packed in a small sealed jar. Still good, barely, but she'd have to find something else tomorrow, and settled her daughter into the cot with her coat bundled around her as a barrier against the wall's cold. Rose fussed for exactly 4 minutes, which Evelyn timed in her head, and then went to sleep with the efficiency of a child who had already learned that the world was not going to arrange itself for her comfort. Then Evelyn went back to the kitchen. She lit the stove. She found the cold beans and set them aside. She went through the pantry and the root cellar and the smokehouse, cataloging by lantern light what was available, which was more than she'd expected. Dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, a half-dozen smoked hams, potatoes, onions, dried apples, a sack of flour that had been stored properly and was still good, lard, coffee, and, unexpectedly, a jar of good molasses on the back shelf with dust on its lid that suggested it had been forgotten rather than saved. She started cooking. She'd been doing it since she was 8 years old, learning beside her mother in an Ohio farmhouse kitchen. And she cooked the way some people pray, with her whole attention, with the particular focus of someone who has found that the act of making something good from raw materials is one of the only things in the world that makes complete and reliable sense. She made biscuits, real biscuits, with lard worked cold into the flour until it resembled coarse sand, then buttermilk from the small ice box to bring it together, rolled out and cut and set in a cast iron skillet. She put on a pot of beans with a smoked ham hock, an onion, and the molasses from the dusty jar and let it begin the long, slow work of becoming something worth eating. She made a skillet of fried potatoes with onion and salt pork, the kind that get a proper crust on the bottom if you leave them alone long enough. She put on coffee strong enough to do actual work. She didn't hurry. Hurrying made things worse. By the time she heard boots on the back porch just before 5 in the morning, the kitchen was warm and smelled like a place where people lived. There were 5 of them, as it turned out, Walt and 4 ranch hands whose names she learned in the first 10 minutes because she asked and because she'd found that learning a man's name immediately was the fastest way to establish that you intended to treat him like a person rather than furniture. Tom was the youngest, maybe 19, with a scar across his chin from what he said was a fence wire, and what Walt's expression suggested was something considerably more avoidable. Pete was quiet and deliberate, the kind of man who doesn't speak unless he has something to say, which Evelyn immediately respected. Hector had been working cattle ranches since he was 12 and had the hands to prove it, thick and roughy and permanently curved, like they'd been shaped by years of rope work. Danny was the talker, cheerful and fidgety, who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely and without malice. They came in expecting cold beans. They found biscuits and fried potatoes and ham and coffee, and the silence that followed their arrival was a different kind of silence than the one at the front door. "Well," Danny said finally, "that's something." "Sit down," Evelyn said, already moving to bring the skillet to the table. "Before it cools." They sat, they ate. Nobody talked much because the food didn't require commentary. It required attention, and they gave it. Tom had 2 biscuits before he'd finished his first helping of potatoes. Pete ate steadily and without expression, but he reached for a second serving of beans without being prompted. Walt caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen at one point and gave her a small, deliberate nod. She was at the stove when she heard the back door, and she knew by the sound of it, heavier, more certain, that it was Caleb Hawthorne. She didn't turn around. She heard the chair pull out. She heard the small pause when he registered that the table was full of food he hadn't expected. "Coffee's hot," she said, without turning. "There's a cup on the shelf." Another pause. She heard him get the cup. She turned then, because she needed to bring the biscuit pan to the table, and she set it down and went back to the stove, and she could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, the way you can feel weather changing. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between suspicion and the unwilling acknowledgement of a person who has been proven wrong about something and hasn't yet decided what to do with that information. He ate. He didn't say anything about the food, but he ate everything on his plate, and he refilled his coffee cup once, and when he was done, he pushed back from the table and looked at her directly. "Storm's coming," he said. "I saw the sky this morning," she said. "If it's the one the Henderson's man warned about last week, it'll be bad. You won't be able to travel." "I understand. That doesn't change the situation." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine it does." He held her gaze for a moment longer, like he was trying to find the seam in her composure, the place where she was pretending to be more settled than she was. She met his eyes and gave him nothing to find. "You'll stay until the storm passes," he said. "Then we revisit the arrangement." "That's fine." He left without another word. Walt, across the table, was carefully studying the grain of the wood in front of him. "Revisit the arrangement," Danny repeated, not quite quietly enough. "Eat your breakfast," Walt said. And that was the end of that. The storm hit that afternoon. It didn't announce itself gradually, the way she might have expected. It arrived like a decision that had already been made. 1 hour the sky was flat gray and heavy, and the next the wind was moving in walls and the snow came horizontal across the valley, and the temperature dropped so fast she could hear the wood of the house contracting. Walt brought her an extra load of firewood without being asked and stacked it inside the kitchen door. Could be 3 days, he said. Could be more. Has it been worse? Once or twice? He said it in a way that communicated he wasn't going to elaborate. You've got enough wood in the house to last a week if you're careful. Stove in the bunkhouse is their problem. Kitchen stove stays going, the house stays livable. I'll keep it going, she said. I know you will. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration, but lived in the neighborhood of both. You got grit, Mrs. Mercer. I'll give you that. It's just common sense, she said. A lot of people don't have it, Walt said, and went back out into the storm. Rose had decided, somewhere between Omaha and Montana, to skip the tentative crawling phase and commit directly to pulling herself upright against any available furniture and lurching forward on unsteady legs. She was not successful at this more often than she was successful, which meant she fell with great frequency, but she had also apparently decided that falling was not worth crying about as long as the ground was relatively soft, and there was something nearby worth getting to. In the storage room off the kitchen, there was not much worth getting to. So Evelyn brought her out to the kitchen during the day, where Rose could grip the leg of the work table and haul herself vertical and survey her territory with satisfaction before toppling sideways into the flour sacks. This was the scene that greeted Tom when he came in from the bunkhouse to ask about lunch and found Evelyn at the stove and a baby sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor surrounded by a loose circle of pots and wooden spoons. Tom stopped in the doorway. Rose looked at him. She bite? He asked. Not yet, Evelyn said, though the week is young. Tom crouched down to Rose's level, which involved a certain amount of awkward folding of limbs, and held out one finger. Rose considered it with enormous seriousness before grabbing it with both hands, apparently deciding it needed to be examined more closely. She's strong, Tom said, with the particular surprise of someone who has had no prior contact with infants and is discovering they are more substantial than expected. She is, Evelyn agreed. What's her name? Rose. Tom looked at the baby, who was now trying to pull his entire finger into her mouth. Hey, Rose, he said, in a voice approximately 3 octaves higher than his normal register. Hey there. Rose made a sound that could charitably be interpreted as a greeting. Tom was completely lost from that moment forward. Evelyn watched it happen and filed it away. She made a pot roast for dinner that night, slow-cooked through the afternoon with what onions and carrots she had, and a splash of the cooking brandy she found on the highest shelf, turned crisp on the outside with a good sear first, and then left to braise in its own steam. She made cornbread, proper cornbread, not the pale dry kind, but the kind with a crust on the bottom from the cast-iron skillet. She put together a dried apple cobbler from the pantry supplies and the brown sugar she found in a tin above the stove. She set the table. She had found linens in a cedar chest in the storage room, someone's careful work, hand-stitched around the edges, clearly not used in a long time. She shook them out and set them on the table because a table set properly was one of the small dignities she knew how to offer. When Caleb Hawthorne came in from whatever he'd been doing in the barn, reinforcing something against the storm, she gathered from the sounds she'd heard through the afternoon. He stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. What's this? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Dinner, she said. I can see that. Then we're in agreement again. He came in. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down. The other men came in and sat, and for a moment there was just the sound of the storm outside and the quiet work of people being fed. Then Pete said, without any particular inflection, I forgot what a real meal tasted like. Danny pointed his fork at the cornbread. Last cook made cornbread like a saddle. You could patch boots with it. Don't speak ill, Walt said, without much conviction. I'm not speaking ill. I'm speaking with gratitude. Danny looked at Evelyn. This is excellent, ma'am. Genuinely. It's just food, she said. No, Pete said quietly. It isn't. She didn't look at Caleb when this was said, but she was aware of him the way you're aware of weather. Peripherally, constantly, without necessarily directing your attention at it. He cleaned his plate. He said nothing about the linens or the cobbler or the dried apple filling that she'd sweetened with the molasses and the last of the brown sugar. But when he got up from the table, he paused in the doorway. The linens, he said. She looked at him. They were my mother's, he said. She held very still. I found them in the cedar chest. I can put them back if you'd prefer. He looked at the table for a moment, at the cloth laid across its scarred surface, ironed smooth, doing exactly what it had been made to do. "No," he said. "Leave them." And he walked out. She heard him moving around the house for another hour after the men had gone to the bunkhouse. She could hear his boots on the floorboards above her when he went upstairs, and then coming back down, and the sound of him in what she thought must be a study or a sitting room, something moving, the creak of a chair. She sat with Rose in the storage room, the one small lamp burning, and nursed her down to sleep, and listened to the storm throwing itself against the walls. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little. She thought she'd be more afraid. But there was something about the simple fact of work done, of food made and mouths fed and a warm room and her daughter sleeping safely that steadied her in a way nothing else could. She had been afraid in Omaha. She had been afraid on the wagon. She had been afraid standing on the porch of this house with 47 cents and a man looking at her like a complication he hadn't budgeted for. But fear, she had discovered, was mostly a thing that lived in the anticipation of hard moments. The hard moments themselves were just work, and she was very good at work. She listened to Rose breathe. Outside, the wind was a continuous low roar, the kind that erases the edges of the world and makes the small lit circle of a room feel like the only place that exists. She was still in Montana. She was still here. For now, that was enough. She woke before 4 and started the stove. It was still dark and still storming, and when she stepped onto the back porch for a moment, just to check the wood supply, just to feel the scope of it, the cold hit her like a wall and the snow was past her knees on the porch steps and still coming. She went back inside and started the coffee. While it brewed, she took stock of what she could make with what she had, running the pantry inventory in her head like an accounting ledger. She had enough for a week, maybe more if she was careful and inventive. She could stretch the flour. The dried beans would last. The smoked hams were good for another 2 weeks at least. The potatoes needed to be used sooner rather than later. A few of them were starting to soften and would need to be cut and dried or cooked through. She made a plan. She always made plans. It was the thing that had kept her upright after Thomas died. Not grief, which was real and large and deserved its space, but also not sufficient as a full-time occupation, but the simple, stabilizing act of making plans for the next meal, the next day, the next thing that needed doing. She was in the middle of these calculations when she heard a floorboard creak above her head, and then the slow descent of boots on the stairs, and then Caleb Hawthorne came into the kitchen while it was still dark, and the storm was still going, and she was the only thing awake in the house. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "I didn't know you started this early," he said. "I start when there's work to do," she said. "Coffee's ready." He got a cup. He stood near the stove, not at the table, in the posture of a man who hasn't decided whether he's staying or going. She worked around him without comment, beginning the biscuit dough. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked, after a while. She looked at him briefly. It was the first personal question he'd asked her. "My mother," she said. "She ran a boarding house in Ohio. I was cooking for 15 men by the time I was 10. "Ohio," he said. "Columbus, then a farm outside Granville. We moved when I was 12. He was quiet for a moment. "Long way from Montana." "Yes," she said. "Why Montana?" She kept her hands moving in the dough. "Because it was far," she said, simply and honestly. "And because you were hiring." He didn't ask the obvious follow-up question. Far from what? And she wasn't sure if that was because he'd guessed, or because he didn't want to know, or because he had been raised in the same tradition of not asking that she had. She cut the biscuits and set them in the skillet. "The storm," he said. "How long do you think?" "Walt said 3 days. The sky this morning says longer." He made a sound of acknowledgement. Outside, the wind shifted direction and hit the side of the house with a sound like a blow. "I need to check on the cattle at first light," he said. "Some of them will have drifted. We'll need to push them back toward the windbreak or we'll lose some to exposure." She nodded. "I'll have food ready before you go and when you come back." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, or not just that, but something adjacent to surprise. The expression of a man who has been expecting resistance from a direction and found instead something solid to stand on. I told you to leave, he said. You did. The storm? I know, she said. The storm changed the immediate circumstances. I understand that. That's all it changed. I know, she said again. She took the biscuits to the oven. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the first one she'd allowed herself, and stood with it at the far end of the work table. Mr. Hawthorne, she said, I'm not asking you to want me here. I'm not asking for charity or for you to feel sorry for me or for anything else that involves your feelings about this situation. She chose her words with care because she'd been carrying them for a while. I'm asking for the chance to do work I'm good at in exchange for fair pay, in a place where my daughter is safe and warm. That's the whole of it. Everything else is yours to decide. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll decide when the storm's over, he said. That's fair, she said. He took his coffee and went back toward the front of the house. She listened to his footsteps move away, and then she went back to the stove, where the biscuits were browning and the kitchen was warm and the storm outside was doing what storms do. Not asking permission, not making accommodations, just moving across the land with the complete indifference of something that has always been larger than the lives it disrupts. She found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind that. She had come 1,000 miles. She had learned to cook in an Ohio boarding house and survived a grief that had tried its level best to hollow her out entirely. And she had crossed half a continent alone with an infant daughter, and she was still standing in front of a stove, still making biscuits, still feeding people. Whatever Caleb Hawthorne decided when the storm ended, she would handle it. She was, if nothing else, very good at handling things. The morning came gray and white and roaring. Caleb took 3 men out into it before 6, their shapes disappearing into the wall of white within 30 yards of the barn, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched until there was nothing left to see, and then she turned back to the stove and kept working. Because that was the thing about hard conditions. They didn't ask you to be ready. They didn't wait for you to feel strong enough or certain enough or sufficiently sure of your footing. They just came. And the only thing that made the difference, the only thing that had ever made the difference in her experience, was whether you kept moving when they did. Rose woke up at 7 with her usual complete absence of preamble, fully asleep one moment and fully screaming the next. And Evelyn went to her and picked her up and held her in the warm kitchen while the storm pressed itself against every window and wall of the Hawthorne house, and the men out on the frozen range fought their way through the drifts to find cattle that had wandered too far. And the ranch sat in the middle of the white world like a small, stubborn fact that refused to be erased. She was still here. That was what she had. She decided it was enough to work with. The storm lasted 4 days. Not 3, the way Walt had predicted, and not 2, the way the sky on the 3rd morning had briefly suggested when the clouds thinned enough to show a strip of pale blue before closing again. 4 days of white and wind, and the particular cabin fever that sets into a working ranch when men who are built for open spaces get confined to 2 rooms and a bunkhouse, and there's nothing to do but wait and tend the fires and find ways to not get on each other's nerves. Evelyn cooked through all 4 of them. She cooked because it was her job, and because it needed doing, and because she discovered cooking was also the most reliable way to manage the atmosphere of a confined space full of people who had no particular reason to trust her yet. A warm kitchen with something good on the stove is its own kind of argument. It doesn't require words. It doesn't require anyone to change their position on anything. It just requires that people sit down and eat, and in the sitting down and the eating, something in them loosens, just slightly, just enough. By the 2nd day, Danny had taken to lingering in the kitchen after meals to talk. At first about nothing in particular, the storm, the cattle, a horse with a bad shoe, and then gradually about more. He was from Missouri originally. He had 3 sisters and a mother who sent him letters he answered badly and infrequently, a fact he admitted with the sheepish honesty of someone who knows they are failing at something and hasn't figured out how to stop. He talked the way some people eat, quickly and with obvious pleasure. And Evelyn let him talk and kept working and offered enough responses to let him know she was listening without encouraging him to mistake her kitchen for a confessional. Hector came in on the 3rd day and asked, without ceremony, if she knew how to make tamales. I know the principle, she said. I don't have masa. Cornmeal, he said. You can work with cornmeal. Different, but close enough. Show me, she said. He did. They worked side by side at the long table for 2 hours, Hector's thick hands moving through the masa substitute with the authority of long practice. And when they were done, and the tamales were wrapped in whatever cloth she could find and steaming in the pot, the smell that filled the kitchen was different from anything that had been in that room in a long time. Something from somewhere else. Something that carried a whole other life in it. And Evelyn watched Hector's face while he stirred the pot and understood that she was not the only person in this house who had traveled a long way from somewhere else and was still carrying it. "My grandmother made these," he said, not looking at her. "Every Sunday. Big pot, whole family." "Where was this?" she asked. "Sonora," he said. "Long time ago." She didn't push further. She understood that some things were offered as information and some things were offered as trust, and that the difference mattered. Pete ate 4 of the tamales at dinner that night and said nothing. But he looked at Hector differently after that, and Hector sat straighter, and Evelyn thought that sometimes feeding people was about more than food. Tom, meanwhile, had fully surrendered to Rose. It happened so gradually that it almost didn't look like surrender. First, he started dropping by the kitchen in the mornings on the pretense of refilling his coffee early, but his eyes always went immediately to wherever Rose was in the room. Then he started leaving small things near her, a smooth stone from his pocket, a piece of ribbon from God knows where, a carved wooden button he'd apparently whittled from a scrap of wood during the long storm hours in the bunkhouse. Rose examined each of these offerings with deep seriousness and then immediately tried to eat them. "She'll choke on that," Evelyn said, removing the button. "Oh." Tom looked stricken. "Sorry, I didn't think." "She doesn't need things to play with," Evelyn said, handing him back the button. "She needs things to pull herself up on. She's trying to walk." Tom spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on the kitchen floor with his knees up so Rose had something to haul herself to vertical by, and the expression on his face, concentrated, gentle, slightly alarmed every time she wobbled, was the expression of a 19-year-old boy who has unexpectedly discovered that something requires his protection and has decided, without particularly meaning to provide it. Walt watched all of this from the doorway one afternoon, his coffee cup in hand, and said nothing. Caleb said less. He was in and out of the kitchen for meals, punctual and efficient, and he ate what she put in front of him and occasionally refilled his own coffee without being asked. And a few times she caught him watching Rose from across the room with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that expressions are neutral only when someone is working at it. But he didn't speak to her beyond what was necessary, and she didn't push for more than what was offered. What she noticed, because she noticed things, it was one of her more useful qualities, was what he did instead of speaking. On the second morning of the storm, she came into the kitchen to find the ash box on the stove had been emptied. She hadn't done it. She looked at Walt, who shrugged in a way that said he knew who had, but wasn't going to say. On the third afternoon, the loose board on the kitchen doorstep that she had been stepping over carefully stopped being loose. She looked at it in the morning, and there were new nails in it, the head still bright. The firewood outside the storage room door, the small personal stack she kept separate from the main supply so she could bank the stove at night without going out to the main woodpile in the dark, appeared every morning freshly stacked, enough for the night ahead, never more and never less, which meant that someone was measuring her usage and accounting for it. She didn't say anything about any of this. Neither did he. It was its own kind of conversation, and she was not going to be the one to interrupt it. The storm ended on the morning of the 5th day. Or rather, it didn't so much end as exhaust itself, the wind dropping over the course of an hour until the silence it left behind felt almost physical. Evelyn stood on the back porch in the cold and looked out at a landscape that had been completely rearranged in white. The drifts were past the fence lines in places. The corral posts were buried to their crossbars. The mountains to the north were so clear in the post-storm air that they looked closer than they were, their faces sharp and white and enormous. She waited. Caleb came out onto the porch behind her. He stood a few feet away and looked at the same landscape. "I'm not going to ask you to leave," he said. She turned to look at him. His jaw was set in the expression of a man delivering a verdict he has spent some time arriving at and is not entirely comfortable with but has decided to commit to. "The arrangement stands, month to month. You cook, you're paid, you have the storage room." He paused. "The room off the kitchen isn't suitable for a child long term. There's a room upstairs that's not being used." Mr. Hawthorne, it doesn't mean anything beyond what I just said. I understand that. I'm not. He stopped, started again. I run a working ranch. I don't have time or interest in complications. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something shift. Not warmth, not yet, but the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating his position on something. The room is the second door on the left upstairs. I'll have Tom move your things. I can move my own things. Tom's got nothing else to do this morning, he said, and went back inside. She stayed on the porch for another minute, looking out at the white world, and allowed herself one small breath that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The arrangement stood. That was something. She went back inside and started breakfast. The upstairs room was small, a single window facing east, a narrow bed with a rope frame, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, bare floorboards. But it was its own room with a door that closed, and the window caught the morning light, and Evelyn had long since stopped needing things to be good in order to work with them. She made it livable in 2 days. She found extra quilts in the cedar chest and layered them on the bed. She turned one of her wool skirts into a kind of padded barrier along the open side of the bed for Rose, who had recently discovered the concept of rolling and applied it with ambitious disregard for edges. She put her few books on the windowsill because they were the only objects she owned that served no practical purpose but whose presence made her feel more herself. She hung the photograph, the one she rarely let herself look at, on a small nail beside the door, turned slightly toward the wall, not hidden, but not displayed, which was the only way she'd found to carry it without being undone by it. Tom moved her bag upstairs and then stood in the doorway looking at the room, the way young men look at things they want to help with and aren't sure if they're wanted. "It's a good room," he said, with the transparent encouragement of someone who knows it isn't much. "It'll do fine," she said, and meant it. He nodded, relieved, and went back downstairs. November moved toward December with the measured patience of a season that knows it has plenty of time. The cold settled in permanently, the kind of cold that doesn't break between storms but lives in the ground and the air as a continuous fact, and the ranch adjusted to it the way ranches do. More layers, shorter working hours in the worst temperatures, more time spent in the barn with the animals, the particular rhythm of a cold weather operation that is less about production and more about holding what you have. Evelyn fell into the rhythm of it. She was up before 4 every morning, stove lit, and coffee on before the men came in, and her day was a continuous chain of small necessities: meals, bread, the ongoing management of the pantry and the root cellar, mending when there was mending to do, and Rose threaded through all of it, carried or contained or closely monitored depending on what her current obsessions were. Rose's current obsession was mobility, and she pursued it with a single-mindedness that made Evelyn tired just watching. She could pull herself to standing reliably now, and she had developed a method of sideways locomotion along any available surface: a wall, a chair leg, a trouser-clad shin belonging to whoever happened to be standing nearby. That technically wasn't walking, but covered ground with surprising efficiency. She fell frequently and took it badly about half the time, which meant the kitchen was punctuated throughout the day by sudden dramatic crying followed, within seconds, by complete cheerful recovery. The ranch hands navigated this with varying degrees of success. Tom was a natural, unhesitating. He would scoop her up mid-cry and make a sound like a horse, which never failed to produce a laugh. Hector carried her on his hip occasionally when Evelyn's hands were completely occupied, with the practiced ease of a man who had been around children and hadn't forgotten how. Pete simply rearranged himself to accommodate her, moving his feet, steadying his chair, creating space in a quiet, automatic way. Danny was the most verbal. He maintained a running commentary on whatever he was doing whenever Rose was within earshot, in a slightly performative way that seemed directed as much at making Evelyn smile as at entertaining the baby. Walt watched all of them and kept his own counsel, which was his way, but Evelyn noticed that he had stopped wiping down the table in a hurry after meals. He lingered now, not by much, just enough to see whatever Rose happened to be doing. Once she caught him holding one of Rose's hands, letting her grip his finger and use it for balance while she stood, and he was looking at her with an expression so private she immediately looked away. She thought she understood it. She didn't say anything. December. The light came later and left earlier, and the nights were very long, and the house at night was different from the house in the day. In the day, it was a working place, functional, purposeful, full of the noise of boots and voices and work being done. At night, it was something else. Quieter, obviously, but also more itself, the way people are more themselves when they think no one is watching. Evelyn stayed up late often, after Rose was down, sitting in the kitchen with whatever mending had accumulated and the stove banked low for warmth, and she could hear the house around her. The creak of the floorboards upstairs when Caleb moved around in whatever room he went to at night, the tick of the cooling metal in the range, the wind against the north wall. She was not lonely, exactly. She was accustomed to her own company in a way that years of practical necessity will produce. But she was aware of the silence in a way she hadn't been in a while, and she wasn't entirely sure what to make of that. One night she came downstairs at past midnight. Rose had woken and then gone back down, but Evelyn was too alert to sleep and found the lamp in the kitchen already lit. Caleb was at the table. He had papers in front of him, ledger sheets from the look of them, columns of figures, and a cup of coffee that had clearly been there a while, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that was less surprise than resignation, as if he'd half expected the kitchen to produce someone. "Couldn't sleep," he said. A statement, not an apology. "Me either." She went to the stove and checked the heat and added a small piece of wood before she put the kettle on. She didn't ask if he wanted more coffee, she just made it. He watched her do this with an expression she couldn't read in the low light. "The ledgers," she said, to say something. "November figures." He looked down at them. "We lost 8 head in the storm. Less than I feared, but it costs." She set his cup next to the old one. "I'm sorry." "That's ranching," he said. Not bitterly, just accurately. She sat down at the far end of the table with her own cup, and he went back to his ledger, and for a while there was just the sound of the wind and the scratch of his pencil and the small domestic sounds of the kitchen. It was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that surprised her. It should have been. The two of them, past midnight, the strained arrangement between them barely a month old, but the silence had a quality of mutual tolerance to it that felt almost companionable, if she was being honest. "Your husband," Caleb said, without looking up from the ledger. "What happened?" She was quiet for a moment. "Fever," she said. "He took sick in April and was gone by June, before your daughter was born. 3 months before." Caleb set down his pencil. He looked at the surface of the table rather than at her, which she found she was grateful for. "I'm sorry," he said. And the thing was, he sounded like he meant it, not in the performed way people say it, but in the way of someone who has their own grief and recognizes the shape of it in other people. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He would have been a good father." She had not said this out loud to anyone before. It sat differently than she expected. Painful, yes, but also somehow right, like setting down something you've been carrying so long you forgot you were holding it. Caleb said nothing. He picked up his pencil again, but he wasn't writing. "You've been here 11 years, she said. "Walt told me." 12 now. "You built it yourself?" "Inherited the land, 40 acres and a burned structure." He turned a page in the ledger, not really reading it. "I built the rest." "Alone?" "Mostly." She could hear something in that word, mostly, that opened onto a larger territory than she knew how to navigate without more information. She didn't push. "You do good work," she said instead. "The house is solid." He looked at her then, briefly, and there was something in his face that was almost confused, the expression of a man who has been expecting one kind of remark and received another. "It's a working house," he said. "I know. It's still good work." He didn't respond to that, but something in his posture shifted fractionally, the way a muscle releases when it's been held tense for too long without the person noticing. They sat in the kitchen until nearly 2 in the morning, not talking much, and it was not the same kitchen it had been when she arrived. She couldn't have said precisely what was different about it. The stove was the same, the table was the same, the cold outside was the same cold. But something in the room had changed, the way a room changes when it has been lived in by people who are beginning, without particularly meaning to matter to each other's days. She went upstairs eventually, and she did not hear him come up until much later. The next morning he had stacked a new cord of firewood outside the upstairs window where she could get to it from the small exterior staircase without going all the way down to the yard. She found it when she went to check the cold and stood looking at it for a moment in the early gray light. He was already out with the cattle. She went back inside and made breakfast, and when the men came in from the cold, there was cornbread and ham and proper scrambled eggs, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and like bread, and Tom said, "Morning, Mrs. Mercer," before he was even fully through the door, and Hector hung his hat on its usual peg, and Pete nodded at Rose where she sat propped against the flour sack examining a wooden spoon, and Danny started talking before he'd taken off his coat, and Walt came last and looked at the table and looked at Evelyn and looked at the room that had a month ago been a cold utilitarian space and was now unmistakably something that held people, and he didn't say anything at all. He didn't need to. December moved deeper into itself, and the mountain cold moved deeper into December, and the ranch held against it the way things hold when they have been built to last and maintained by people who care enough to keep showing up. Evelyn baked bread every other morning. Real bread, yeast bread, the kind that needs time and attention and fills the whole house with a smell that works on people in ways they don't always realize until they notice they've been standing in the kitchen longer than they intended. She mended the curtains in the front room with a piece of calico she found in the sewing box, and they looked better, not perfect, but better. She found that the sitting room, a room she'd initially treated as Caleb's territory and passed through only when necessary, had a small collection of books on the shelf beside the window, mostly practical things, farming almanacs and a surveyor's guide, and a legal volume she assumed had to do with land, but also, tucked on its side behind the almanacs like something that had been put there without thinking too much about it, a collection of Whitman's poetry that had been read enough times that the spine had cracked in 2 places. She didn't take it out, but she noticed it. The men began to treat her kitchen the way people treat a place they consider partly theirs, with the ease of familiarity, the small, casual ownership of people who have been welcomed enough times to stop waiting for the invitation. They refilled their own coffee. They brought firewood in without being asked. Danny started washing his own plate after meals, and then Pete followed without comment, and eventually all of them were doing it, which saved her 20 minutes every morning, which she used to sit with Rose. None of them ever mentioned it. She never thanked them. It was the kind of arrangement that only works if nobody names it, Caleb noticed. She could tell by the way he watched it, the sideways attention of a man cataloging information without reacting to it. He noticed the way the kitchen had changed and the way the men moved through it differently, and he noticed Rose learning to take her first actual lurching steps between the table leg and Tom's outstretched hands. And once she caught him standing in the kitchen doorway for a full minute watching Rose attempt to circumnavigate the flour sack, and his face in that moment was something she hadn't seen on him before. He looked, very briefly, like a man who had forgotten to keep his expression arranged. She pretended not to notice. She turned back to the stove and gave him the privacy of an unobserved moment, because there are things people need to feel for the first time without an audience. Rose made it around the flour sack. She sat down hard on the other side of it, in the sudden boneless way babies sit when they run out of momentum, and looked enormously pleased with herself. From the doorway, though she didn't turn to confirm it, Evelyn heard Caleb make a quiet sound. Not quite a laugh, something shorter than a laugh, but in the right neighborhood. She kept her eyes on the stove. The house breathed around them, warm and worn and imperfect and holding, which was the most any of them had asked of it. The second storm came without the courtesy of warning. The first one, back in November, had at least announced itself. The sky going that particular shade of yellow-gray in the afternoon, the wind picking up from the northwest in a way that Walt had read correctly and immediately. This one came from the east, which Walt said later was unusual, and it came fast, the way bad things often do, without the preliminary performance that might have given them time to make better decisions. It was the 3rd week of December, and Caleb had taken all 4 ranch hands out to the far pasture at first light. The cattle had been drifting north again, Terce. They always drifted north in deep cold, some instinct pushing them toward the tree line where the wind broke, and 3 days of watching it from the ridge had convinced Caleb they needed to push the herd back toward the lower pasture before the temperature dropped further. It was a half-day job in reasonable conditions. Maybe a full day if the cattle were being stubborn, which they often were. The sky that morning had been clear and hard and blue, the particular winter blue that looks clean and honest and gives nothing away. Evelyn had packed food for them, biscuits wrapped in cloth, dried meat, a flask of coffee each, And she'd stood on the back porch and watched them ride out, 5 shapes moving through the white field, getting smaller, and then the tree line swallowed them. She went back inside. She fed Rose. She started the bread. She cleaned the ash from the stove, swept the kitchen floor, checked the root cellar inventory against what she'd used in the past week, and made a mental note that they were getting low on dried beans and would need the next supply run to account for it. By 10 o'clock, the light had changed. She noticed it first in the way the kitchen window went dim. Not the gradual dimming of clouds moving in, but a sudden reduction, as if someone had pulled a shade. She went to the back door and opened it and stood looking at the eastern sky. And what she saw made her step back inside immediately and close the door behind her and stand very still for a moment. The eastern sky was the color of a bruise, and it was moving fast, a wall of it. And the air had that particular electric quality that precedes something serious, a pressure change you feel in your teeth more than here. She thought about the 5 men at the far pasture, 12 miles out, and she thought about the flask of coffee and the biscuits she'd packed, and she pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table and breathed for a moment. Then she started working. She built the fires up, the kitchen stove to its maximum, the fireplace in the front room, the small stove in the upstairs hallway she'd rarely used but knew was there. She brought in wood until the stack inside the back door was as high as she could safely pile it. She filled every pot and pan she owned with water and set them near the stove before the cold could freeze the pump line, which she knew from Walt was a real possibility in a serious storm. She found every blanket in the house and piled them at the top of the stairs. She filled the lamps. Rose watched all of this from her position propped against the kitchen wall with the serious attention of a small person who doesn't know what is happening but understands that something is. "It's all right," Evelyn told her, not because she was certain of it, but because saying it steadied her own hands. The storm hit at noon. It didn't build this time. It arrived. One moment the world was visible through the windows, and the next it was completely white. The wind so loud it drowned out everything else. And the temperature dropped so fast that the inside windows frosted over within 20 minutes, despite the fires Evelyn had built up in every room. She checked the front door. She checked the back door. She went upstairs and checked every window latch. She brought Rose up to the bedroom and settled her in the middle of the bed, surrounded by blankets, and came back down to the kitchen. She put on soup, not because she was hungry, but because it was the most useful thing she could think to do, and because the act of making food, of standing at the stove with a specific task in front of her, was the only reliable mechanism she had for managing the particular fear that was trying to establish itself in her chest. 12 miles. In this, she knew cattle drives. She had grown up around farm work, and she had come across enough working men in enough difficult conditions to understand what 12 miles in a blizzard meant. It meant they would not be coming back today. It meant they would find shelter, a line shack, a ravine, the lee side of a rock formation, and they would stay there and wait it out, and there was nothing she could do about any of it. She knew this. It did not make the afternoon easier. She kept the fires going. She fed Rose. She paced the kitchen once, caught herself doing it, and stopped and stood at the stove and stirred the soup. Outside, the wind found every gap in the house's construction and probed it. She could feel cold air moving across the floor near the front door, and there was a whistle in the upstairs window she'd noticed before, but which now had a more urgent quality. She found rags and stuffed them in the gap under the front door, and went upstairs and did the same for the window. Night came early, or what passed for night. It was hard to tell when the world outside had been uniformly white and gray since noon. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was gone entirely, and Evelyn was on her second lamp and her third cup of coffee and had reorganized the pantry shelves twice, which was the kind of thing you do when you are trying not to think. Rose went down at 6, earlier than usual, worn out by the day's low-grade strangeness, the way babies are worn out by things they can sense but not understand. Evelyn sat in the kitchen alone and listened to the storm. It was worse than the November blizzard. She was certain of that. The November storm had been loud and prolonged, but this had a different quality. A meaner quality, if weather could be mean. Something in the relentlessness of it. The way it didn't gust and ease and gust again, but just drove steadily, continuously, like something that had made a decision and was committed to it. She thought about Caleb. She tried not to, and then she stopped trying not to because there was nothing productive in the effort and she was too tired for the pretense. She thought about him the way you think about someone when you have lived in close proximity for 6 weeks and paid attention, which she always paid, to the way a person moves through their days. She thought about the firewood stacked outside her window. She thought about the nails in the doorstep and the empty ash box in the midnight kitchen and the sound he had made, not quite a laugh, when Rose circumnavigated the flour sack. She thought about 12 miles and the bruise-colored sky and the flask of coffee that had been cold for hours by now. She kept the fires going. She kept the soup hot. She stayed awake. It was past midnight when she heard it, a sound different from the storm, something with intention to it, a banging that had rhythm, human rhythm, not the random percussion of wind against wood. She was at the back door before she'd fully registered what she was doing, and she pulled it open against the wind's resistance, and the cold hit her like a wall, and through the white she could see shapes, 3 of them, then 4, then Walt's voice cutting through the storm. "Mrs. Mercer, light the lamp in the door, we can't see the—" And she grabbed the lamp from the kitchen table and held it out, and the shapes came toward it. They came in pieces. Walt first, ice in his beard, moving stiffly. Then Danny, who had his arm across Tom's shoulders and whose face was too pale. Then Hector, who was half carrying the last one, and the last one was Caleb. She saw him and felt her stomach drop. He was not unconscious. His feet were moving, doing their part, but his head was down and his color was bad. And when Hector brought him through the door and the warmth hit him, he shuddered so violently that Hector almost lost his grip. "How long?" she said, already moving to Caleb's other side. "He went in after a calf that fell through the creek ice," Hector said, his voice tight and exhausted. "Maybe 2 hours ago. We got him out, but he was already—" "Into the front room," she said. "The fireplace. The bunkhouse might be—" "The fireplace is already built up," she said. "The bunkhouse will take an hour to get to temperature. Front room, now." They moved. The fire in the front room was burning high and orange and hot, the way she'd kept it all day. And they brought Caleb down in front of it, and Evelyn was already working at the buttons of his coat, her fingers fast and certain, and the coat was so stiff with ice that the fabric cracked when she bent it back. "Tom," she said, without looking up. "Get the blankets from the top of the stairs. All of them. Danny, there's soup on the stove. Get it in a bowl. See if you can eat some first yourself because you need it. Walt, sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine," Walt said. "You're shaking so hard I can hear your teeth. Sit down." A pause that lasted about 1 second, then the sound of Walt sitting down. She got the coat off. The shirt beneath it was wet and cold, and she had it unbuttoned before Tom came back with the blankets. And there was a moment, brief, practical, stripped of everything except necessity, where she pulled the wet shirt from Caleb's shoulders and pressed her palm flat against his sternum to measure how cold he actually was. And the cold she felt there frightened her in a way that very few things had frightened her in the past several months. He looked at her. His eyes were open and present, which was the main thing. She'd been afraid for those 2 hours of what she might find when they came through the door, and the eyes being open and present was the thing she'd most needed to see. But his focus was slow, and his lips had the color she didn't want to see, and when he tried to say something, his jaw wasn't cooperating fully. "Don't talk," she said. "You need to be warm first." She wrapped him in the blankets, all of them, the whole pile Tom had brought, and positioned him as close to the fire as was safe and stayed right there, close enough that she could feel the heat on her own face. She rubbed his hands between hers, working at the fingers, making sure the blood was moving, and she kept her eyes on his face and watched his color the way you watch something you need to change. "Evelyn," he said. His voice came out wrong, rough and slow. "I told you not to talk. The calf." "I don't care about the calf." Something moved in his face. "You should care. That's a full season's—" "Caleb?" She said his name, just his given name, the first time she had used it, and the word came out with more force than she intended. "The calf can wait. You cannot. Be quiet." He was quiet. The color came back slowly, first in his face, where the firelight helped, then in his hands, which she kept working between her own. She could feel when the shuddering changed quality, going from the violent, uncontrolled shaking of serious cold to the lesser, more manageable trembling of a body regulating itself. And she tracked that transition with the focused attention of someone who has no room for anything else. Danny brought soup, and she held the bowl, and he drank it without argument, which told her more about his condition than anything else. Caleb Hawthorne, she had come to understand, did not accept help without argument as a general rule. Walt had taken over the stove situation, getting the men fed and warm and settled in the front room with their own blankets, and Evelyn was dimly aware of voices. Tom asking Danny about something, Hector's lower voice, Walt moving in and out. But the main thing in her attention was the man in front of her, and the fire behind him, and the slow returning evidence that he was going to be all right. Sometime past 2 in the morning, the shuddering stopped entirely. He was leaning back against the settee. She'd moved him off the floor once it was safe to. And his color was almost back, and his eyes were tracking normally, and when he looked at her this time his focus was sharp. "You stayed awake," he said. "Of course I did." "You couldn't have known when we'd come back." "No," she said. "I couldn't." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is processing something he doesn't have an established category for. "How long have you been awake?" "Since yesterday morning." He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "The fires. I built them all up at noon when the sky changed." "You didn't know what to do with yourself," he said. It was not a question, and it was precise enough that she felt it land somewhere. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't." He looked at the fire. His hands, she noticed, were back to their normal color, the knuckles less white, the skin less tight. She became aware suddenly that she was still holding one of them, had been holding it without noticing, the way you hold a thing you are afraid of losing without quite realizing you've made the decision to hold on. She set it down, carefully, on the blanket. Neither of them commented on this. "Go to sleep," she said. "You need to." "Mrs. Mercer." "Evelyn," she said, "at 2 in the morning, after all of this, I think we can manage first names." A silence. "Evelyn." He said it as if he was trying the word out. "You should sleep too." "I'll sleep when you're properly warm." He made a sound that was partly resignation and partly something else she didn't attempt to name. "You're very stubborn," he said. "You're just noticing?" And there it was. A real one this time. Brief and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while but still worked. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way to a full smile, but it got close enough that she could see the shape of what it would be. She looked away, at the fire. She sat with him until she was certain he was asleep, which took another hour, and then she checked the fires one more time and went to the kitchen and stood at the window looking at a storm that was finally, slowly, beginning to ease. She was more shaken than she wanted to be, and she knew it. She'd been frightened before. The night Thomas died, she'd been so frightened she hadn't been able to feel her hands. But this fear had a different texture. It was the fear of someone who has begun to want something to stay, and is only now fully reckoning with how much. She had not meant to begin wanting things. It complicated the arrangement, which was supposed to be simple: work, pay, a safe place for Rose. She had built those walls deliberately, with the care of a person who knows exactly why they're building them, and she had been fairly certain they were holding. She was less certain now. She made coffee because it was almost 4 and there was no point in sleep, and she stood in the kitchen of the house that had been a stranger's house 6 weeks ago, and was now, if she was honest, and she generally tried to be, something more complicated than that. And she listened to the storm losing its conviction outside, and thought about walls and what they were actually for, and whether the ones she'd built were protecting her or just keeping her somewhere smaller than she needed to be. She didn't arrive at any conclusions. She made breakfast instead. The men slept late that morning, later than any morning since she'd arrived. And when they came through the kitchen, they were quieter than usual, the quiet of people who have been through something that has temporarily spent their words. They ate without much talking. Tom looked at Rose when she appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, and his face did something relieved, as if she was a specific comfort he'd been needing. Rose, oblivious to the drama of the past 20 hours, immediately demanded his attention by grabbing his boot. Caleb came downstairs at 9. He was moving stiffly. She could see it in how he held his shoulder, something that would need to be watched. And he was pale in the way of someone who has burned through their reserves. But he was upright and present, and he went directly to the coffee as if establishing that he was himself again. He stood at the stove with his cup and looked at the kitchen. At the pots she'd used and cleaned and used again through the long night, at the blankets she'd stacked in the corner, at Rose conducting her morning business near the flour sacks. And then he looked at Evelyn. She was at the work table, cutting bread. "Eat something first," she said, without looking up. "Then we can talk about the shoulder." A pause. "How did you know about the shoulder?" "You're favoring your left side. Has been since you came in last night." Another pause. "It's fine." "I'm sure it is," she said, in a tone that indicated she intended to make that determination herself at some point today. Walt, sitting at the table with his coffee, was studying the ceiling with great apparent interest. Caleb sat down. He ate. And across the table, Tom was doing something with a block of wood and a small knife. Whittling, she'd realized weeks ago, was Tom's equivalent of what cooking was for her, the thing his hands needed when his mind was unsettled. And the wood shavings were falling on the kitchen floor, and Evelyn had told him twice about this. But this morning, she let it go. She let it go because he had come home. They all had. The storm had taken its best shot, and the house had held, and the men in it were alive and accounted for. And she was standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and bread, and the wood smoke from 3 fires she had built and maintained through a very long night, and the fear that had lived in her chest since noon the previous day was dissolving into something less defined and more permanent. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name, but changes things once you have it. She did not examine it too closely. She put more bread on the table. She refilled the coffee. She picked up Rose when she demanded picking up and settled her on one hip and kept working with the other hand because this was how she'd operated for months now, and she was good at it. Caleb watched her do this. She noticed. She always noticed. But she kept her eyes on her work. That night, after the kitchen was cleaned and the men were in the bunkhouse and Rose was asleep upstairs, she passed the door to the small room at the end of the hall that she'd never had reason to open. It was latched, always, and she'd assumed it was storage. And she noticed that the latch was undone and the door was open by an inch. She almost kept walking, then she stopped. She pushed the door open gently with one finger. It was not a storage room. It was, or it had been, once, a workroom of some kind with a workbench along one wall and tools hung on pegs, and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and something recent, something worked on recently, the sawdust too fresh and too pale to have been sitting long. On the bench was something partially built. She looked at it for a moment in the dim light from the hallway. It was small, curved, meant to rock. The joints were fitted with a precision that spoke of someone who had taken time with it, who had not been in a hurry, who had done and redone the work until it was right rather than merely done. One side panel was not yet attached, and there was a piece of sandpaper folded on the bench beside it, and the wood itself was a good cedar, smooth under her fingertip when she reached out to touch it. A cradle. She stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. She thought about the firewood and the nails and the emptied ash box and the midnight kitchen and the almost smile by the fire at 2 a.m, and she thought about how a person who does not want to feel things will sometimes put everything he feels into what his hands make instead, because it is safer and because wood does not ask questions and does not complicate arrangements and does not look at you in the way that requires you to decide something. She stepped back. She pulled the door to its original inch-open position and walked back down the hall to her room and stood at the window for a moment in the dark. Outside, the storm was fully gone. The sky was clear and black and full of stars, the kind of sky Montana produces after a big storm. When the air has been scoured clean of everything and what's left is just the stars, sharp and cold and very far away, and the land under them white and still and enormous. She looked at it for a while. Then she got into bed beside her sleeping daughter and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her, and she thought about cradles and cedar wood and a man who stacked firewood in the dark and then never mentioned it, and she felt something shift in the quiet of that room, something that had been in the process of shifting for weeks, that the long frightened night of the blizzard had moved to the edge of, and that the small room with the unfinished cedar cradle had finally tipped all the way over. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but she stopped in that moment, pretending it wasn't there. She never mentioned the cradle. 3 days passed after the blizzard, then 4, then a week. And she said nothing about the workroom or the cedar or the sandpaper folded on the bench. And Caleb said nothing about it either, and the unfinished thing sat in the room at the end of the hall like a thought neither of them was ready to finish out loud. But she noticed that the door stayed unlatched. And sometimes at night, when the house had gone quiet, and she lay awake listening to Rose breathe, she would hear the faint sound of movement from that end of the hall. Careful, deliberate, the sound of a man working slowly and with attention. And she would look at the ceiling in the dark and feel the strange particular weight of being known by someone who hasn't said so yet. Christmas came and went without ceremony, the way it does on working ranches where the animals don't observe the holiday and the work doesn't pause. Evelyn made a molasses cake, and Danny produced, from some recess of his bunk, a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a significant occasion, and Walt declared that surviving 2 blizzards in 6 weeks was significant enough. They sat around the kitchen table after dinner, and the men drank, and she had a small amount, and Rose sat in Tom's lap and grabbed at his cup repeatedly until he gave her a spoon to hold instead. And it was not a grand celebration by any standard, but it was warm and it was theirs, and that was enough. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He didn't say much, that was not new, but he stayed. He was still favoring his left shoulder, which she had wrapped twice and which he'd allowed without the argument she'd expected, and he held his cup on the right side and watched his men with an expression that was too complicated to summarize, but that contained something she recognized as a man taking stock of what he has. At one point, Danny raised his cup and said, "To Mrs. Mercer, who kept the fires going and the soup hot and didn't lose her head when the rest of us were freezing ours off." The men lifted their cups. Evelyn looked at the table. "Drink your whiskey, Danny." "She can't take a compliment," Danny said, to no one in particular. "She can take it fine," Walt said. "She just doesn't need it." She looked up at Walt then, and he met her eyes with the steady look of a man who means what he says, and she nodded once, and that was the end of the ceremony. Caleb was watching her when she turned back. She held his gaze for a moment, just a moment, and then he looked away, and she looked away, and neither of them acknowledged that there was anything to look away from. January arrived the way it always does in Montana, without apology, without moderation, cold that made December feel like a trial run. The kind of cold that makes the air hurt to breathe and turns exhaled breath to ice crystals before it disperses. The kind that cracks wood and freezes pump lines and requires the daily, methodical management of every fire in the house, as if warmth itself is a thing you have to fight to keep. Evelyn fought to keep it. She had learned the house by now the way you learn a thing you live inside. Its drafts and its warm corners, the stove's particular moods, which windows let in cold and where to stuff the rags against it. She had learned that the kitchen lost heat fastest through the north wall, and that the front room fireplace drew best with the door left 2 inches open, and that the upstairs hallway was reliably 5 degrees colder than anywhere else, which meant she kept a blanket at the top of the stairs for Rose. She had also learned Caleb's patterns, which she could not have fully prevented even if she'd tried. He was up before she was, most mornings. She would hear him on the stairs and then outside, checking the barn before the temperature rose even slightly. He came in for breakfast and said what was necessary and not much more. But the quality of his silence had changed over the months, become less like a wall and more like weather, something you exist alongside rather than something that excludes you. He worked through the afternoon and came in at dark, and ate and sometimes sat for a while with his ledgers or the maps he studied occasionally. Land surveys, she thought, though she'd never asked. And sometimes he went directly to the room at the end of the hall, and she would hear the soft sounds of work. She had not decided what to do with what she felt. She was practical enough to know what it was. She was honest enough not to pretend it was something simpler than it was. And she was cautious enough, marked enough by the particular education of losing someone without warning, to hold it carefully and not rush at it, the way you move carefully around a fire that could warm you or burn you depending entirely on how you approach it. It was a Tuesday in the second week of January when the thing that had been building between them finally broke open. She had not planned it. She suspected he hadn't either. The men were in the bunkhouse after dinner, and Rose was upstairs and asleep, and Evelyn was in the front room by the fireplace with the mending she'd been putting off for a week. Caleb came in from wherever he'd been, the barn, by the smell of the cold on him, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her there. "I thought you'd gone up," he said. "Not yet." She kept her eyes on the mending. "There's coffee if you want it." He got coffee. He came back and sat not at the far end of the room, but in the chair at the other side of the fireplace, which was closer than he usually positioned himself, and for a while there was just the fire and the silence and the sound of snow against the window. Then he said, "I had a family." She looked up. He was looking at the fire, his coffee cup balanced on his knee, his face in the half-light doing something complicated. A wife. 2 daughters. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed for a long time and still aren't sure you can get through. Fever came through in the summer of '79. They were gone in 3 weeks. All 3 of them. The mending sat still in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it the same way he had meant it, months ago in the midnight kitchen. Not as a formula, but as an actual thing, carrying actual weight. "I built this ranch after." He turned his cup in his hands. "Bought the land the following spring, and came out here and started building and didn't stop for about 2 years. Working was the only thing that—" He paused. "It was the only thing that felt like it had a shape. Everything else was just noise." She understood that. She understood it precisely. "The girls," she said carefully. "What were their names?" He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Surprise, maybe, that she'd asked about the girls specifically, rather than redirecting away from the pain of it, the way people often do. "Clara," he said, "and Nora." Clara was 6. Nora had just turned 4. She held those names for a moment. Clara and Nora, 4 and 6. "They sound like real people," she said. He made a sound that was nearly broken and then wasn't. "They were." He set the coffee cup on the side table and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire for a long time without speaking. She waited. "I didn't think I was going to stay in this," he said at last. "In living. For a while there, I really didn't think I was going to stay in it." The room was very quiet. "But you did," she said. "Had to decide to." He looked at his hands. "Every morning for about a year. Had to decide every single morning that I was going to stay in it for another day. Like a choice you make over and over until it doesn't feel like a choice anymore." She knew about that too. She had made that choice in the weeks after Thomas died. In the double weight of grief and the pregnancy she was carrying alone, the decision to get up and feed herself and keep going, not because she felt ready to, but because her daughter would need her to have made that decision 100 mornings before she arrived. "Thomas had been sick for 2 months before the end," she said. "I knew it was coming. The knowing doesn't help the way you think it will." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't." "When he was gone, I had $30 and a pregnancy and a farmhouse that belonged to his cousin who wanted it back." She looked at the fire. "I sold everything I could sell, and I answered every employment advertisement I could find for 6 months. Most of them didn't want a woman. The ones that did, the conditions were—" She stopped. "They weren't safe." He was watching her. "Your advertisement said no nonsense," she said. "That sounded like someone who would say what they meant. I took a chance on that." "I almost sent you away," he said. "I know." "I would have been wrong to." It was said plainly, without the performance of a man trying to apologize gracefully, just a fact, delivered straight. She appreciated that about him more than she could have easily explained, the way he dealt in plain facts even when they didn't flatter him. "You were operating on the information you had," she said. "I was being closed off and rigid and looking for a reason." "A reason for what?" He paused. "To not let anything change." He said it like a man reading a diagnosis he's already known for a while. "It's easier. When everything stays the same, there's nothing that can—" He stopped again. "Get taken away," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes." The fire shifted and settled, throwing a new angle of light across the room. "I put the photograph on the wall," she said, not entirely sure why she was saying it, except that the conversation had opened something in her, and it seemed dishonest to let him be the only one standing in it. Turned toward the wall, not hidden, just not displayed. "I noticed," he said. She looked at him. "You've been in my room?" "The door was open one morning when I came upstairs. I wasn't—" A pause. "I saw it." She thought about what it looked like from the outside. The photograph at that angle, turned just slightly. "I can't look at it straight on yet," she said, "but I can't put it away either. It feels like, if I put it away, I'm deciding something about what he meant." "He meant what he meant," Caleb said. "Putting a photograph away doesn't change that. I know that in my head, but not yet in the other place." "No," she said. "Not yet." They sat with that for a while. The fire burned. Outside, the Montana cold pressed against every wall of the house and found the house holding. Rose doesn't have his eyes, Caleb said. It was not quite a question. No, she has mine. Evelyn looked at her own hands in her lap. I was terrified she'd come out looking nothing like him, and then I'd lose even that. But she has his temperament, the stubbornness, the way she goes at things until they work. She'll give you trouble when she's older, Caleb said. Tremendous amounts of it. Good, he said, and the word came out quieter than he'd probably intended, with something in it that wasn't quite wistfulness, but lived nearby. She understood then what Rose meant to him. Not a complication, not an inconvenience, not the problem he'd initially named her, something that had walked into the calcified silence of this house and demanded, simply by being itself, that the people in it practice being alive again. Clara and Nora, 4 and 6. She felt the grief of that, his grief, not hers, but she felt it secondhand the way you feel weather from behind glass. And she didn't look away from it. The cradle is almost finished, she said. The stillness that followed had a specific quality. You went in the room, he said. The door was open an inch. I didn't go in. I looked from the doorway. A beat. The joinery is very good. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to something lower and less guarded. I've never built one before. I had to look at a neighbor's to understand how the... He stopped. Anyway, it's good work, she said, just as she'd said it about the house, just as she'd meant it both times. He looked at her across the fireplace, and this time neither of them looked away quickly. The fire was between them and around them, and the house held its cold out, and she thought about walls again. The ones you build to protect yourself and the ones that end up just being prisons, and the long, slow work of learning the difference. I don't know how to do this, he said. It came out rough, like it cost him something. She looked at him steadily. Neither do I. That's not reassuring. I know, I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer. He laughed, a real one, short and surprised and real, and it changed his face entirely, and she stored it away without meaning to, the way you store things you discover you want to keep. Something in the room had shifted irrevocably. She could feel it the way you feel the moment a season actually changes. Not the calendar date, but the actual moment, which is always quieter and less dramatic than you expect, and tends to arrive when you're not looking directly at it. 2 days later, the cradle appeared in her room. She came upstairs in the afternoon to check on Rose and found it beside the bed, finished, sanded smooth, the cedar smelling clean and faintly sweet. It rocked with an even, quiet motion when she touched it. The inside had been lined with what she thought was a piece of flannel from one of his old shirts, cut carefully and fitted around the interior with more precision than the work required. Rose, who had been outgrowing the bed barrier arrangement for weeks, took to it immediately. Evelyn stood looking at it for a long time. Then she went downstairs. Caleb was at the kitchen table with his ledgers. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside his papers and sat down across from him. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked back at his ledgers. She could see, even from across the table, that he wasn't reading them. She wrapped her hands around her cup and sat in the kitchen that had started as a stranger's kitchen and was now something else entirely. Something without a clean name, something that had been built quietly and incrementally out of biscuits and midnight conversations and firewood stacked before dawn and the sound of careful work coming from a room at the end of the hall. Walt came in for his afternoon coffee and looked at the two of them sitting on opposite sides of the table, each apparently attending to their own business, and poured himself a cup and stood leaning against the counter with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the specific atmosphere of a room where something has changed but nobody has named it yet. He drank his coffee. He put his cup in the basin. He went back outside without saying a word, which was, she had come to understand, Walt's highest form of approval. The ranch hands noticed the change without discussing it. The particular tact of people who live in close quarters and have learned the survival value of minding their own business. Tom was more careful than usual about leaving wood shavings on the floor. Hector started taking his coffee outside in the mornings, which had nothing to do with preference and everything to do with giving the kitchen a different kind of quiet. Danny, remarkably, talked somewhat less. The work of the ranch continued. The cattle needed managing. The barn needed maintenance. Fences were checked and repaired, and the endless practical machinery of keeping livestock alive in a Montana winter ran forward on its own momentum, and Caleb was in the middle of all of it, every day, as he had always been. But he came in earlier in the evenings, not much earlier, 20 minutes maybe, half an hour. Enough that he was in the kitchen when Evelyn was finishing dinner rather than arriving after it was already on the table, and those 20 minutes had their own texture. Him at the table with whatever he was working through, her at the stove, Rose conducting her evening business somewhere between them, and the ordinary sounds of the house doing what houses do when they are inhabited by people who have decided, not all at once but slowly and then all at once, that the other person is someone they want nearby. He helped her without ceremony. That was the thing she noticed, and kept noticing, that it had stopped being a conscious choice on his part and had become reflex. He would take the heavy pot from the stove without being asked. He would pick Rose up when she fussed and hold her with the slightly uncertain but committed posture of a man who is learning something he didn't expect to need to learn. And Rose, who had from the beginning regarded Caleb Hawthorne with the complete undefended openness of someone too young to manage her own heart, would grab his collar and look at him with her dark eyes like he was a thing she had always planned to keep. One evening he was standing at the window with Rose on his arm, the two of them watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the Bridger Mountains, and Evelyn looked up from the stove and held very still for a moment. She had done this before, looked up and found a scene that stopped her. But this one was different from the others. This one had the quality of something that had always been supposed to happen and had simply been waiting for the right conditions. He was talking to Rose in a low voice, too low for her to make out the words, pointing at something in the fading sky, and Rose had both fists in his collar and was listening with her whole body tilted toward him. He did not know Evelyn was watching. She turned back to the stove. She did not tell herself it meant nothing. She was done telling herself things that weren't true. The ranch that had been a stranger's place in November was something else now in January, and they were something else in it, all of them. The men in the bunkhouse who had become, without ceremony or announcement, a kind of chosen family. The woman who had arrived with 47 cents and a determination to stay. The rancher who had tried to send her away and built a cradle in the dark instead. Nobody had planned any of it. That was the truest thing about it. February came in harder than January, which nobody had thought possible. The temperature dropped to the kind of numbers that stop being meaningful, past the point where cold is a condition and becomes simply the permanent state of the world, where the snow on the ground no longer looks soft but is crusted over into something closer to stone, where the horses breathe clouds that freeze before they fully disperse, and the cattle stand in the windbreak with their heads down and their patience tested. The days were short and gray, and the work of keeping everything alive was relentless, in the way that only winter ranch work can be relentless. Not dramatic, not crisis, just the daily grinding necessity of showing up and doing it again. Evelyn showed up. She did it again. Every morning. She had stopped counting the days since she arrived, somewhere around the 6-week mark, when the counting had started to feel like waiting for something, and she was no longer waiting. She was living here. That was the distinction that had quietly established itself without her fully choosing it, the difference between a temporary arrangement and the actual texture of her days. Rose took her first real, unassisted steps on a Tuesday morning in February, not the lurching, supported steps she'd been doing for weeks, grabbing at trouser legs and table edges and Tom's outstretched fingers. Real steps. 3 of them. Across the open floor of the kitchen from the flour sacks to the work table, unsupported, unannounced, with the expression of someone who has been planning this privately and has decided the moment is now. Evelyn saw it from the stove. She set down the spoon she was holding and pressed both hands over her mouth. Tom, who was sitting at the table and had a ringside view, made a sound like air leaving a balloon. Did she just— Yes, Evelyn said through her hands. Rose sat down on the other side of her 3 steps with the satisfied thump of a person who has completed a task to her own standards. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Tom. She appeared to be waiting for the appropriate response. Tom picked her up and held her above his head, which produced the full-body shrieking delight that had become her standard response to being airborne. And the noise of it brought Danny in from the back porch, and Hector in from the barn doorway, and Walt up from wherever Walt had been. And within 4 minutes, the kitchen contained more celebration than it had held since the Christmas whiskey. Caleb was not there. He was out at the north fence, where 2 posts had heaved in the freeze and needed resetting before the cattle found the gap. Evelyn knew because he'd told her at breakfast, in the brief functional exchange of information that had become their morning habit, what the day's work was, what she needed from the root cellar, whether there was anything requiring his attention before he went out. She told him that evening. She told him the way you tell someone news that belongs to them as much as you. Not announced, just placed in front of him when he came in from the cold and was standing at the basin washing his hands. She walked today, she said, 3 steps, on her own. He went still with his hands in the water. She kept talking so he had somewhere to look other than at her face. Tom saw it. He nearly fell off his chair. She did it like she'd been waiting for the right audience. Caleb dried his hands. He turned around and looked at Rose, who was on the kitchen floor conducting her usual evening investigation of anything within reach. And his face did the thing it sometimes did now. Went briefly unguarded, showed what was actually in it. 3 steps, he said. She sat down after like she'd made her point. He crouched down to Rose's level right there on the kitchen floor, and Rose looked at him with her full attention and then grabbed his outstretched finger in both fists. He didn't try to get her to walk again. He just stayed there for a moment with her holding his finger and looked at her like she was something he needed to look at. She'll be running by spring, he said. The thought terrifies me, Evelyn said, and she was only half joking. He stood up. He went to the table and sat down and picked up the day's mail that Walt had brought in from the post drop. They got mail once a week, whenever one of the men made the supply run into the nearest town, and she watched him sort through it with his usual quiet efficiency and thought about 3 steps across a kitchen floor and the way a man crouches down to a baby's level and stays there for a moment longer than he needs to. March announced itself as a loosening. It wasn't warm, it was nowhere near warm, but something in the quality of the cold changed, became less absolute, less permanent feeling, and the light came back in increments that were noticeable if you were paying attention. The days stretched at both ends, the sky holding light until 5 and then 5:30 and then nearly 6, and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to develop a soft edge in the afternoons. Evelyn noticed it from the kitchen window and felt something open in her chest that had been closed since November. Not sadness exactly, but the particular ache of a person who has been enduring something and only recognizes it as endurance when it begins to ease. She had survived the winter. More than survived. She had made something in it, out of it, from the raw materials of a temporary arrangement and a kitchen that smelled of cold grease and a man who had told her to leave at first light. The winter work wound down as March progressed. The worst of the cattle management eased, the fences held, the days became workable again, and the particular intensity that had defined the ranch from November through February, the state of continuous managed emergency that was a Montana winter, began to release its grip. It was in this loosening that Caleb became paradoxically harder to read. He was not cold. He was never cold now, not in the way he had been in November, that deliberate maintained distance. But he was quieter in a different way, more internal, carrying something she could see in him but couldn't name. He still came in earlier in the evenings. He still picked Rose up when she demanded it, which was often. He still stacked the wood and fixed the things that needed fixing and said what he meant without ornamentation. But he was thinking about something. She could feel it the way you feel weather. Not seeing it directly, but sensing the pressure of it, the way the air changes before what it is about to do. Walt felt it too. She could tell by the way he watched Caleb in the mornings, the same careful peripheral attention she used herself. It came on a Thursday, March, 2nd week, a day that had actual sun in it, the first full day of sun in what felt like months, the kind of clear, cold, bright day that Montana produces occasionally in late winter, like a reminder of what's coming, the light on the snow so sharp it was almost painful. Evelyn was on the back porch beating dust out of a blanket when Caleb came around the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her there, and she knew immediately, from the quality of the stop, from the set of his jaw, from the fact that he hadn't come from the barn or the pasture, but from the direction of the main road, like he'd been walking, that whatever had been building in him had reached its edge. "The winter work is done," he said. She set the blanket over the porch railing, most of it. "The next supply run could take you to Bozeman." He said it evenly, with the particular flatness of a man delivering something he has made himself say in a specific way. "If you wanted to go on from there, anywhere you wanted to go." I'd pay you through the end of April and give you something extra for the winter. What you did. She looked at him. The sun was behind him and the snow was very bright, and she could hear, from inside the house, the sound of Rose in the kitchen being attended to by Tom, who had taken on this responsibility with the commitment of a person who has found a purpose. You're giving me a way out, she said. I'm giving you a choice, he said. You came here because you needed work and because there was nowhere else. That's different from... He stopped. His jaw worked. You should have a choice. That's all. What if I don't want to go to Bozeman? He looked at her. The sun was doing something complicated to his face. Evelyn, what if the choice I want to make is to stay? I need you to know that you can leave, he said, and the intensity in it surprised her. Not anger, something closer to desperation, the sound of a man who needs to be sure that what he's about to ask comes from the right place. I need you to know that before I say anything else, that there's money and there's a way out if you want it, because I'm about to say something that I need it to be a real choice, not something you agree to because you don't have options. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not be able to do it. Then, this is a home because of you, not a house. A home. I didn't know the difference until you showed it to me. He said it directly, the way he said everything, without attempting to dress it up. Rose is... He stopped. I would like to be the person who watches her run by spring. I would like to do that as her family, as your family. His voice was steady, but only just. I'm asking you to marry me. And I'm asking you to know, before you answer, that you're not obligated to say yes, and that there is a real alternative, and that what I feel for you is not something I'll punish you for refusing. The back porch held them both. She could feel her own heartbeat. She thought about November, the frozen ground under her boots, and the man in the doorway looking at her like a mistake, and the 47 cents and Rose against her chest, and the 1,000 miles behind her that she had crossed. Not because she was brave, but because she had no better idea, and because forward was the only direction that had anything in it. She thought about the firewood stacked before dawn and the nails in the doorstep and the cradle in the room that smelled of cedar and the midnight kitchen and a man saying, I had to decide every morning in a voice that told her he knew exactly what that decision cost. She thought about Clara and Nora, 4 and 6, the grief he'd built an entire ranch on top of, not to bury it, but because there was nothing else to do with your hands and you had to do something with your hands. She thought about Thomas, his face, which she could see clearly again now without the photograph, which she had turned fully forward on the wall the morning after the January fireside, and which sat there now, visible. Not a wound, but a fact. A good man, a real man, gone at 30 years old from a fever he shouldn't have died from. The father Rose would not remember, and would spend her whole life in some sense looking for. Caleb Hawthorne was not Thomas. He was harder and quieter, and more damaged and less easy. And he had tried to send her away and had built her daughter a cradle in secret instead. And she trusted him in the specific way you trust someone you have watched be real for months. Not performed, not polished, just real, with his closed-off mornings and his careful hands, and the way he laughed like it surprised him every time. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, because once hadn't seemed like enough. Something moved through his face that she had never seen on it before, not quite relief, not quite joy, something prior to both, something that was the expression of a man realizing that the thing he was most afraid of losing was not, in fact, lost. He crossed the porch in 2 steps, and she had just enough time to register that he was going to do it before he did. Pulled her in with both arms, rough and certain, and not graceful about it at all, his coat cold against her face and his grip too tight, the hug of a man who has been holding himself at a careful distance for months, and has finally stopped. She held on. They stood on the back porch of the Hawthorne Ranch in the March sun with the snow brilliant around them and the sound of Rose's voice inside the house and Tom's answering low response. And she held on to this difficult, private, slowly thawing man and felt something in her own chest that she had thought, at some point in the last year, she might simply never feel again. She had been wrong about that. She was glad to have been wrong. Inside the house, they told the men at dinner. Evelyn had not planned the telling, and Caleb had not either. It came out sideways the way real things often do. Because Walt asked why she hadn't started the biscuits, And she said she'd been on the back porch. And Tom said doing what? And there was a pause in which both she and Caleb were apparently equally unwilling to explain it. And then Caleb said, "We're getting married." The silence lasted approximately 1 second. Danny stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up and then sat down and then stood up again. "I knew it," he said. "Walt, I told you. I told you in December." "You tell me everything in December," Walt said, but he was looking at Evelyn with an expression that made her want to look away. He didn't stand up. He just nodded, slow and deliberate, the way he nodded at things that mattered. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and then, with intention, "Caleb." Tom was across the table with his hand out before Walt finished speaking. "Congratulations, boss." He shook Caleb's hand and then, apparently deciding this was insufficient, turned to Evelyn and looked for a moment like a man who wants to hug someone and isn't sure if that's allowed, and then hugged her anyway, briefly, with the earnest inelegance of a 19-year-old who is happier than he knows how to manage. Hector stood and extended his hand and said something in Spanish that she didn't catch all of, but caught enough of to understand it was something genuine and generous. And she thanked him, and he nodded and sat back down and looked at the table in the composed way he had that covered everything. Rose, present in her usual position on the kitchen floor, observed all of this with the imperial calm of an infant who does not understand the specifics, but approves of the general atmosphere. Caleb sat through it with the expression of a man who is being celebrated and isn't entirely sure what to do with that, which she recognized and found privately endearing, and she sat beside him at the table and the dinner got cold, and nobody seemed to mind. They were married on a Saturday at the end of March. No minister. The nearest one was 2 days' ride, and the snow on the mountain passes was still unpredictable. And more to the point, neither of them felt the ceremony required an audience beyond the people who were already there. Walt, as the longest established adult on the property and a man of evident seriousness, said the words, ones they'd worked out together the night before, plain and without embellishment, the kind of words that mean what they say because they don't reach for more than that. "I take you as you are. I will stay in it with you. I will not make you carry things alone." That was what Caleb said. She had written her own. "I take you as you are, not who you were and not who you might become. I take the man who stacks the firewood and fixes the doorstep and stays in it every morning. I will match you in it, day by day." Hector cried. He turned away and looked at the wall, but his shoulders gave him away. And when he turned back, his face was composed, but his eyes were red, and nobody said a word about it. Danny said several words about it, all of them enthusiastic, and Walt told him to be quiet, and Tom was grinning so hard his scar pulled white. Rose passed between the arms of ranch hands who had somehow, over the course of one winter, become people she had always known, grabbed Hector's collar and regarded the proceedings with the serious dark eyes she had gotten from her mother, and would carry her whole life. Spring came the way spring comes to Montana, argumentative and slow, giving ground reluctantly, a warm day followed by a cold week followed by 2 warm days, and then snow again, as if the season doesn't fully trust itself to commit. But it came. The snow line retreated up the mountain faces. The south-facing slopes went muddy and then green at the edges. The creek came up with snowmelt and ran fast and cold and clear. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window one morning in April and watched the first real green appear in the near pasture. Not the gray-green of dormant grass, but actual green, living green, the color that means something has survived. Caleb came up behind her and stood at the window. They looked at the same green together. "More fencing this week," he said. "I know, I heard you telling Walt. East pasture is soft, but the herd needs to move. I'll need everyone out." "I'll pack enough for the day," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder. Just that. His hand on her shoulder while they both looked out the window at the greening pasture and the mountains beyond it still white at their tops. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of a person who has decided that another person is where he is and is putting that fact into the plainest available language. She put her hand over his. This was their life. Not perfect. Never that. And she had long since stopped wanting perfect, which was a fiction that required too much maintenance. The men tracked mud into the kitchen. The cattle were always getting somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Caleb was still difficult to reach on hard mornings, still went quiet in the ways she was learning to navigate rather than solve. She still sometimes stood in front of Thomas's photograph and felt the particular helpless grief of something real that ended too soon. But she made biscuits every morning in a kitchen that knew her hands, and Rose's cedar cradle sat in the upstairs room gathering the particular dignity of things that were made with care. And the ranch hands who had been strangers in November were the people who held her daughter when she needed to use both hands. And Walt drank his coffee at the kitchen table every afternoon like a man who is exactly where he intends to be. And Caleb Hawthorne, who had tried to send her away at first light, and had built a cradle in the dark, and had decided every morning for years to stay in it. That man came home every evening and came in earlier than he used to, and sat at the table of the house that was now genuinely a home. And one evening in late April, Rose walked to him from across the kitchen, not 3 steps but 8, solid and determined, and her whole face blazing with the satisfaction of a person who has gotten where she was going. He caught her. He held her in both arms against his chest, and she grabbed his collar with both fists and looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes. And his face, she was watching, she was always watching, was the face of a man who has found something he did not think he would ever have again and is not, this time, going to hold it at arm's length. Outside, the spring was doing what spring does, taking the land back from winter, turning the bare and frozen things towards something living. Inside the kitchen, the stove was warm and the coffee was on, and the house breathed around them. Not the held breath of an empty place waiting for something to fill it, but the real breath of a place where people live, where things get made and broken and repaired, where meals are eaten and hard things are said and children learn to walk and men who have forgotten how to let anyone close remember, slowly and imperfectly, what it was they were holding themselves back from. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It looks like a woman knocking on a door with 47 cents and a baby on her hip and standing straight when the door opens. It looks like a man who lost everything building a cradle in a room at the end of the hall and not knowing what to do with what his own hands are telling him. It looks like 2 people, both marked, both cautious, both carrying the weight of what they've survived, sitting across a kitchen table at 2 in the morning because neither of them can sleep, and finding that the silence between them has changed, that it no longer keeps them separate but holds them together, the way walls hold a house, the way a house holds a life. The frontier was what it had always been, hard and indifferent and larger than any of the people on it. That didn't change, but Evelyn Mercer had known, somewhere in the part of her that survived things by being honest about them, that the land was never the point. The point was what you built on it. The point was what you kept.